Cavalry are almost always depicted in media as thundering headlong into battle with a glorious charge. However, considering the mechanics behind such a maneuver reveals just how dangerous it can be for the rider. One wrong bounce, one wrong blow, one wrong anything, and you could easily find yourself tumbling to your death. On top of this, consider that for most of antiquity, cavalry forces went into battle without stirrups or even saddles. This revelation turns the whole modern idea of a cavalry charge on its head. Today, let's explore the history of ancient cavalry and how on earth they managed to dominate the battlefield despite these seemingly crippling handicaps. A big thanks to the Great Courses Plus for sponsoring this video. They offer subscription-based, on-demand lecture videos put together by top professors from renowned universities and specialists from places like National Geographic and the Smithsonian. You get unlimited access to a huge library of over 11,000 videos, which cover topics from history to science, math, and literature, with new content being added every month. Their history playlist is honestly amazing, and they have an incredibly detailed 26-part series on the campaigns of Alexander. To enrich our own content, definitely check out Lecture 5 on King Philip II and the Macedonian Way of War. For me, I found it best to download the app on my phone. This allows me to swap from video to audio mode so I can listen to the series as a podcast while going about my daily activities. Right now, the Great Courses Plus is offering a free trial, which you can start by clicking the link in the description below or visiting thegreatcoursesplus.com/Invicta. I highly recommend that you take a look at what they have to offer and dive into the material that you are most interested in. Man's history with the horse dates back thousands of years. The relationship was at first adversarial, with humans of the Ice Age hunting various primitive breeds in the plains and forests. However, things would begin to change when the first horses were domesticated across various parts of Europe and Asia some 6,000 years ago. These original herds were much smaller than our own modern breeds, and most closely resembled the Przewalski horse, which can be found out on the steppe today. Among settled societies, the horse was first used as a simple beast of burden, dragging carts, wagons, and plows in agricultural or commercial settings. It's in this capacity that they initially joined the army as baggage animals. Soon, military commanders of the Bronze Age began toying with their use as actual combat forces on the battlefield. The ancient Sumerians, for instance, were among the first to deploy battle carts for war, and by the early 2nd millennium BC, these had evolved into two-spoked war chariots drawn by a team of horses. The premier military powers of the age, such as Assyria and Egypt, deployed these en masse to great effect. This is an important part in our narrative, as it shows that the act of riding a horse was proving difficult given the small size of the mounts and a lack of associated expertise and technology on the part of the rider. Sure, people still rode horses for scouting or communication, but under battlefield conditions they were seen as an unreliable weapons platform. Better to stick warriors on a chariot, where they could at least mount or dismount as needed, whilst also having enough space to make unencumbered use of ranged weapons. Over the following centuries, the chariot spread across the Mediterranean and was quickly adopted by other militaries. We cover the history of these Bronze Age units in a previous video, which you can also check out to learn more. Suffice to say, chariot use saw an eventual decline with the Bronze Age collapse, which was further exacerbated by competition from the rise of mounted cavalry. I want to make it clear though, that this was not some clean-cut change from one technology to the other. History is rarely so neat. After all, many places never really adopted the chariot as a significant military unit and had been riding horses all along. This was especially true amongst the nomadic communities, which had long incorporated the horse into their herding and hunting practices. For instance, we can date the development of the bit on the steppe to over 1,000 years before the development of the wheel. The primarily nomadic communities would have been the first to work out the intricacies of mounted warfare, proving their worth against more settled communities and thus convincing them to give it a try too. This would be done with varying degrees of sophistication. Many simply rode bareback. In North Africa, for instance, the Numidian Cavalry were famous for riding into battle with nothing but a small rope to control their mounts. Yet despite this primitive arrangement, they were brutally effective in combat as agile light cavalry. In other places, the more advanced method would involve a bridle with bit and reins to control the steed, as well as using cloth laid over the horse's back and fastened to its body for comfort of both man and animal. The combination went a long way towards making the experience of riding far more reliable. It was thus quickly adopted by cavalrymen across the Mediterranean, everywhere from Persia to Greece, Rome, Carthage, and Iberia. Yet upon closer inspection, even this setup seems quite lacking. You're telling me a rider had to control the horse, grip his weapon, and somehow keep his balance, all while traversing rough terrain and enduring the shocks of battle without a saddle and stirrup? It's an incredible challenge. let's take a closer look at how our ancestors achieved this feat. We can start with the simple act of getting on the horse, a process that is hard enough today. This can be done from a standing position by using a block or assistant. However, neither are practical in combat, and riders would have to find a way to mount on their own. One method involved using the reins, bridle, and mane to manually pull oneself up using brute strength. Another method involved using a spear and strap as a makeshift foothold for stepping up into position. A third method involved a straddled jump over the horse from the rear, while other techniques might call for the horse and rider to be advancing side by side and using momentum to mount successfully. Or alternatively, the horse could lay prone and stand up only once the rider had positioned themselves above them. On top of this, I'm sure there are many other ways people found to mount their horse. Great, so now our ancient warrior is officially a mounted cavalryman. Now they must advance. Anyone attempting to do so will quickly find out just how bumpy the experience can be. Luckily, humans have had a long history of mastering the technique. Even today, one can find countless guides for riding a horse without a saddle and stirrups. However, I'd prefer to quote directly from Xenophon's 4th century BC manual on horsemanship for a more period-appropriate description. He writes, quote, "For the rider fairly seated, whether bareback or on saddlecloth, a good seat is not that of a man seated on a chair, but rather the pose of a man standing upright with his legs apart. In this way, he will be able to hold onto the horse more firmly by his thighs, and this erect attitude will enable him to hurl a javelin or to strike a blow from horseback if occasion calls, with even more vigorous effect. The leg and foot should hang loosely from the knee. By keeping the leg stiff, the rider is apt to have it broken in collision with some obstacles, whereas a flexible leg will yield to the impact and at the same time not shift the thighs from its position. The rider should also accustom the whole of his body above the hips to be as supple as possible, for thus he will enlarge his scope of action, and in case of a tug or shove, be less liable to be unseated. Next, when the rider is seated, he must, in the first place, teach his horse to stand quiet until he has drawn his skirts from under him, if need be, and got the reins an equal length and grasped his spear in the handiest fashion. And in the next place, he should keep his left arms close to his side. This position will give the rider absolute ease and freedom, and his hand the firmest hold. This general advice still holds true today. Sit upright, but maintain a supple position, and move with the back of the horse. Doing so can be achieved fairly easily in the training fields, but maintaining this pose over extended periods of time takes years of practice and physical conditioning. It's for this reason, and the price of owning and maintaining a mount, that shock cavalry forces in Antiquity were typically restricted to a small number of elite warriors. Now on to combat itself. Modern audiences often imagine this as entailing some epic headlong charge into the enemy. However, such attacks were extremely rare, as they run counter to the animal psychology of the horse, which will refuse to run into a wall of spears without the most extensive of training. Most of the time, cavalry were instead used as skirmishers to disrupt formations as cover for the main army's deployment, or as preparation for a more determined assault. Here's a relevant passage from Xenophon on the matter. Quote, "If it ever happens that you have an enemy's camp in front, and cavalry skirmishing is the order of the day, that being at one time charging the enemy right up into the hostile battle line, and again beating a retreat. Under these circumstances, it is well to bear in mind that so long as the skirmisher is close to his party, valor and discretion alike dictate to wheel and charge in the vanguard might and main. But when he finds himself in close proximity to the foe, he must keep his horse well in hand. This, in all probability, will enable him to do the greatest mischief to the enemy, and to receive least damage at his hands." Xenophon then goes on to talk about the use of javelins, of which a rider would have had at least a pair. Quote, "As regards range of discharge and shooting, we are in favor of the longest possible, as giving more time to rally and transfer the second javelin to the right hand. And here, we will state shortly the most effective method of hurling the javelin. The horseman should throw forward his left side, while drawing back his right, then rising bodily from the thighs, he should let fly the missile with the point slightly upwards. The dart so discharged will carry with it the greatest force and to the furthest distance. We may add too, with the truest of aim, if at the moment of discharge the lance be directed steadily on the object aimed at." For some light cavalry, like the Numidians, this would be done repeatedly with a large bundle of javelins. In this way, they would charge at the enemy, unleash volleys, and dash away like a flock of birds. Any who attempted to pursue would be simply kited into oblivion. A similar tactic was used by the horse archers of the east and the steppe. Even heavier cavalry often began combat with this sort of ranged dance before closing the distance to deal with the enemy in close quarters. However, as we mentioned, this was not typically done against dense blocks of formed infantry. Rather, they would strike at other, more fluid masses of cavalry, loosely organized light infantry, or the exposed flanks and rear of heavy infantry formations. However, their true power came when the enemy ranks had broken and fallen to rout. It is at this point that most casualties occurred and that the cavalry got their kills. Here is more relevant advice from Xenophon on this sort of training. Quote, "Since it is a matter of prime necessity that the rider should keep his seat while galloping full speed on every sort of ground, and at the same time be able to use his weapons with effect on horseback, nothing could be better where the country suits and there are wild animals than to practice horsemanship in combination with the chase. But when these resources fail, a good exercise may be supplied in the combined efforts of 2 horsemen. One of them will play the part of the fugitive, retreating helter-skelter over every sort of ground with the lance reversed and plying the butt end. The other pursues, with buttons on his javelins and his lance similarly handled. Whenever he comes within javelin range, he lets fly at the retreating foeman with his blunted missiles, or whenever within spear thrust, he deals the overtaken combatant a blow. In coming to close quarters, it is a good plan first to drag the foeman towards oneself, and then, on a sudden, to thrust him off. This is a device to bring him to the ground. The correct plan for the man so dragged is to press the horse forwards, by which action the man who is being dragged is more likely to unhorse his assailant than to be brought to the ground himself. Thus, we have hopefully painted a picture of how most cavalry from antiquity trained for and engaged in battle without stirrups or saddles. But one main question still remains. Why didn't they use them? Surely this would have been simple to achieve, with huge benefits in combat. Let's now discuss. So for starters, I want to point out that the use of advanced saddles and stirrups was not a necessity for delivering the desired shock charges we've been talking about. This is evidenced by the success of heavy cavalry units such as the Macedonian companions, the Saka steppe lancers, and the Parthian cataphracts. Therefore, we should understand that riders with enough practice were indeed able to perform well enough on the battlefield. History has no predetermined chain of evolution, and a new technological development was not immediately necessary. Nonetheless, change did inevitably occur. Once again, the pioneering was led by the nomadic Asian tribes. It's here, among the Scythians, that we see some of the first early saddles with a solid frame appear around the 3rd to 5th century BC. The design of a tree frame was important as it helped distribute the rider's weight more evenly across a horse's back, increasing comfort, safety, and stability. A proper design, however, took many cycles of trial and error to get right. A version of this eventually made its way to the Mediterranean. The Romans took this up quite readily, and by the 1st century BC had started to use a 4-horn saddle design. Its protrusions helped brace the rider's thighs, freeing their hands to make better use of a sword, spear, and shield. This saw particularly heavy use in the east, where the Romans deployed increasing numbers of cataphracts to match their eastern counterparts. Soon, more and more riders were using variants of these rigid tree saddles. Additional developments saw the extension of the front pommel and rear cantle to better secure the rider in combat. It is this, more than any other advancement, that strengthened the charges of shock cavalry. Eventually, the stirrup too finally arrived on the scene. Admittedly, there had been some prior forms in use for some years, but these were rarely anything more than looped ropes. The problem had always been that putting pressure on such footholds risked simply flipping the rider and their seat off the top of the horse. It wasn't until the development of the rigid tree saddle and its more even distribution of weight that the stirrup could actually be used safely. Once again, this first occurred out on the steppe around the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Its use certainly helped one mount a horse more readily, but more importantly, it let one achieve better balance and reach. This was a huge benefit for protracted melee and archery. Its potential was demonstrated with deadly effect by the invading horse tribes of late antiquity. By the 600s AD, the Byzantines began using them, and in short order, so too did the rest of Europe. During the medieval period, the further development of the high saddle and heavy lance would further change the dynamics of mounted combat, but that discussion will have to wait for another time. I hope you've appreciated this deep dive into the history of shock cavalry from antiquity and the mechanics of their training. Definitely check out our other relevant videos on the Numidian and Macedonian cavalry for more episodes on mounted warfare from the past. Hope you enjoyed, and see you in the next one.